Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
At one point, there is a clash between the Dutch and some troops of the Nayaka of Madurai. It's not a very big clash, but among the Dutch soldiers, there's a particularly strong, powerful soldier who on his own kills lots of soldiers. In the end, the Dutchman is killed himself. The Madurai troops are so impressed by the skills and the bravery of this soldier that they take this Dutch guy from the battlefield. They chop off his head because on the one hand they want to show, we have defeated this mighty warrior, but then they embalm the head and they incense the head, and with music and dancers and whatnot, they return it to the Dutch. So this is also very two-sided. So on the one hand, they want to show the Dutch, hey, we have defeated your strong soldier, but we also really respect him, and we return his head in a respectful way.
The Heirs of Vijayanagara, Court Politics in Early Modern South India by Lennart Bes, is a comparative study investigating court politics in four kingdoms that succeeded the South Indian Vijayanagara Empire during the 16th to 18th centuries. Ikkeri, Tanjavur, Madurai and Ramnad. Building on a combination of unexplored Indian texts and Dutch archival records, this research offers a new analysis of political culture, power relations, and dynastic developments. This monograph provides detailed facts and insights that contest existing scholarship. In this episode of BIC Talks, author and researcher Anirudh Kanisetti is in conversation with author Lennart Bes. And now, over to Anirudh.
Thank you, Lekha. Let me just say at the outset that The Heirs of Vijayanagara is possibly the greatest book that I have read about the Nayaka period in my entire life, and I'm sure that is going to have a tremendous impact on scholarship of the period for decades to come. So congratulations, Lennart, to begin with, on this tremendous achievement. I've been reading it practically every day of the last month, and it is so exciting for the way it kind of peels back this veil on what is arguably, I think, one of the most fascinating periods of South Indian history, and yet one that's paradoxically one of the least understood periods of the peninsula. So to begin with, I'd like to set a little bit of context, right? So very often when we think about the Vijayanagara Empire, it's very often believed that its history ended in 1565 with the Battle of Talikota. But as Lennart shows through his book, emperors of Vijayanagara were very much contemporaries of the Mughals, and there were some emperors who were even contemporaries of Shah Jahan. Simultaneously, the Vijayanagara kings were also the contemporaries of the Dutch and British East India companies. And I think, in fact, we will come to a discussion about the Dutch East India Company later, because Lennart does some absolutely fantastic things with Dutch sources through the book. So to begin with, Lennart, what I'd like to understand is, what do you make of this idea that Vijayanagara ended in 1565? What do we really mean when we say that the Nayakas are the heirs of Vijayanagara? And who exactly were these Nayakas? Where in South India could they be found?
Yeah, okay, that's a lot of questions that I could talk about for hours. But very briefly, you're entirely correct by saying that it is usually thought that after 1565, Battle of Talikota, Vijayanagara sort of vanished, and then nothing much happens in the far south until the British arrive. So it's sort of a blank spot or a dark period. What happens in 1565 is, of course, that Vijayanagara capital, this very glorious, amazing, rich place, is attacked by the Deccan sultanates. The capital is razed. The court flees, but doesn't disappear. They establish other capitals, Penukonda, Chandragiri, Vellore, so more in the Andhra and Tamil-speaking area. And they actually exist for about another century. And it's still a very important political and cultural focus point for other kingdoms. But at the same time, its power does slowly decrease. And at the same time, Vijayanagara actually fragments, and all these former provincial governors all over the empire, or local chiefs that were acknowledged and incorporated in the empire, they become more and more independent and more powerful. So while Vijayanagara disintegrates, these successors, as we call them, Vijayanagara successor states, rise and become increasingly powerful. Some actually grow into very large, mighty kingdoms, but at the same time, they still formally acknowledge the superior status of Vijayanagara. That's another reason why we call them Vijayanagara successor states, because Vijayanagara keeps on playing sort of legitimizing role. And then by the mid 17th century, this last capital of Vijayanagara, much shrunk, Vijayanagara is finally conquered and the empire disappears. And that means that these successor states in Karnataka, present-day Tamil Nadu mostly, become really, practically speaking, independent. So that's sort of the story. And then they flourish in the 17th and 18th centuries, before the British arrive. That is very briefly the story of these Nayaka kingdoms.
It really boggles my mind to try and think of them in a kind of historical perspective, free of a lot of our modern assumptions, right? Because Vijayanagara is very often thought of as this quote-unquote Hindu empire that falls to quote-unquote a Muslim coalition, which isn't necessarily the case. And the reality of like who these Nayakas were and how they would have seen themselves is quite different. And you said a little earlier about how the Nayakas in some case are local chiefs who are assimilated into the Vijayanagara apparatus, and in other cases they are parts of the Vijayanagara imperial structure. And I think that's a very interesting point, and you kind of see that through the book. With yet another recommendation that you read it, the book examines different aspects of like how the Nayakas worked, from their court protocol to the role of courtiers to, of course, their relationship with the Deccan Sultanates and the Mughals. And it very systematically, and if I may say so, very elegantly kind of goes through the evidence that we have from every single one of these successive states, and then does a comparative study at the end of each chapter. And that has I think it's a very powerful way of doing this, because it allows us to get an insight into the regional differences between all of these kingdoms, and shows that you can't really paint them all with a single brush. The way that the legacy of Vijayanagara is taken forward by each of these kingdoms is different. And that depends also on their origins, both in relation to Vijayanagara and independently. Especially fascinating to me, the Nayakas in the Tamil country, including, of course, the Nayakas at Tanjavur, Madurai, and their offshoots, including the Setupatis of Ramnad. What's so fascinating to me is that these guys aren't locals. They are actually Telugu warriors of the Balija caste, who are sometimes merchants, sometimes just peasant warriors, who actually migrate into the Tamil region alongside Vijayanagara's expanding power and then kind of settle down there. They bring with them this very kind of ornate, kind of classical courtly Telugu style, along with all the advancements and extraordinary developments in that culture that are happening in Vijayanagara, and they continue it for generations after. And I think before you, Lennart, of course, I think the most important scholarship on this culture was by Velcheru Narayan Rao and David Shulman, which made the argument that the Nayaka kingship was very different from Vijayanagara kingship, right? That was much more interested in hedonism and in kind of showing the public generosity and wealth of the Nayaka, and of course his sexual prowess. And there was a tremendous role for courtesans and the poetry that was written by courtesans. So including some of the great classics, of course, of the Telugu literary canon. So I'm curious, I mean, through all the work that you've done about the Nayakas, what kind of impression do you have of them as people? How do you think they saw the world and how saw their place in the world?
Let me start by saying that this 16th to 18th century South India was a very layered, complex, dynamic and cosmopolitan world. So there were these legacies of Vijayanagara, but all these successor states, these Nayakas, also looked back to earlier kingdoms. They also tried to establish ties with smaller local kingdoms. Then there was, of course, a strong influence from the Islamic world. And because these influences were mostly transmitted through the Persian language, we often call them Persianate influences. And then, of course, there was also the European presence, which also had some sort of impact, not so much as later, of course, but still already some impact. So you have all these different spheres, all these different influences that come together. And what you also see, you mentioned it too, there's a lot of migration, there is a lot of new kingdoms being founded, there's trade. So these were very cosmopolitan, rich worlds. And of course, that led to all kinds of changes, for instance, with regard to kingship. So you refer to the work of Velcheru Narayana Rao, David Schulman, and let's not forget Sanjay Subramaniam, who with the three of them wrote probably the most important book ever on the Nayaka states, at least those in Tamil Nadu. And for me, that book has been everything, something I have related to in many ways. Most of the time I agree. Who would I be not to agree? Sometimes I slightly disagree, but that book is absolutely a milestone. And one of the things you say is, one aspect of the new kind of kingship there was sexual prowess. True. It was related actually to a growing attention in this period to the body, to physical aspects, and the enjoyment of physical matters. There's the term boga, physical enjoyment. So that was, for instance, sexual adventures, but for instance, also the consumption of food. I have not much to contribute to that aspect of kingship, because the interesting thing is that Rao and Schulman and Subramaniam actually constructed this new idea of kingship from Indian sources, which in a way is a bit ironic, because usually it is being said that the Europeans wrote about Asia in an Orientalist, stereotyping manner. And in these European sources, it was often, lust, sex, harems, those kind of things that were being mentioned, exaggerated, in European sources. In this case, actually, that part comes from the Indian sources. And the interesting thing is that the Dutch actually never write about such things. So what Rao, Schulman, and Subramaniam have done mostly is sort of write about kingship in a more general way, as it appears from Indian literature. As you said, Telugu text, Sanskrit text, Tamil texts. And they also write about these kingdoms, in a more general way. So they sort of sketch this highly court culture and kingship. What I've been doing, and that's why I think my book is an addition to their work rather than a correction, I wrote about day-to-day politics. What actually happened? So if a king died and a new king had to ascend the throne, how did it work? Who played a role here? Also, I've really looked at the individual kingdoms to distinguish them. So, to summarize my answer, this was a new age, very cosmopolitan, very complex, very rich, in which many things changed, and there's still a lot that we can say about it, still a lot that we have to research. And I've tried to contribute my part. And in a way, it was high time, because that previous book by Rao, Schulman, and Subramaniam, it's from 1992, so it's already 30 years old. So I hope that I've contributed to this field.
One thing that you briefly touched upon is this idea of bhoga, of the king's prowess in sex, in food, and in various other things, as being a mark of his power and his exceptionalism, I would say, among humans. And of course, you see that in various titles of the Nikas, in which they practically describe themselves with amazing humility as gods on earth. But what also struck me about this was this extraordinary sense of continuity. They seem to also be picking up from elements of medieval Indian court culture, which is, of course, an area that I focus on. So 500 years before this, 600 years before this, the Manasollasa, which is a text written in the northern Deccan by the Chalukya king Someshwara III, already divides the activities of the king according to bhoga. It talks about the bhoga of food. It talks about the bhoga, of course, of sex, and all of these things. So it really is quite remarkable to see how that thread seems to carry itself through those many centuries, while absorbing these influences from all these new kind of contacts and new kind of cultures that are coming into southern India, especially the Persianate cultural world. And then we see them flourishing and blooming in the 17th, 18th centuries from the eyes of the Dutch, of all people. You really have to think, what would the Chalukyas have thought of all of this, of
Yes.
all these completely unimaginable influences. And it really goes to show how remarkably globalized, I suppose, for lack of a better word, the Nayaka polities are. I think one of my favorite images in your book is of one of the Setupatis of Ramnad entertaining, I think, a Dutch official in the palace, and I think you mentioned it's on one of the inner doorways, leading into the private sections of the palace. And it's so striking because it shows a king in what we can perhaps call a quote-unquote classical Indian costume, where he's got his heavy pearl necklaces, and he's just wearing a dhoti, and he's otherwise shirtless, and he's got all the marks of Shiva on his forehead and his arms and all that. And then there's this European gentleman wearing a top hat and a coat, and it's just such a striking. And they don't see a contradiction in this, right? They won't necessarily have seen this as somewhat surprising. And as an Indian millennial who has been wearing trousers and coats my entire life, it is just so striking to see this painting in which this Indian man seems so at home wearing this lungi or dhoti that is the European costume that seems out of place in India. It's just one of those striking little details in your book. But to come back to the question, really, I suppose it's two-sided. The first is, how did the Nayakas engage with legacies before Vijayanagara? I mean, of course, it goes without saying that as former Vijayanagara officers, as chiefs allied to Vijayanagara, that they would look to Vijayanagara for inspiration and legitimacy. But did they also look to early Indian kingdoms? Did they see themselves as being part of older kind of historical trajectory? And secondly, since I mentioned also the Persianate world, and you also mentioned the Persian world they're interacting with, how did they see the Persian world, and where were they taking influences from? Now, we know that Vijayanagara was competing with other Deccan sultans, and you have the Vijayanagara kings calling themselves sultan among Indian kings. But was that necessarily the case for the Nayakas? How had the world changed for them after the fall of Vijayanagara?
You have this older Indic tradition. You have the Persianate influences, and then you have the Dutch. And how does it sort of come together? Well, it does. So you mentioned the Mana Solasa, which refers to Boga. It also refers to lots of other things, like, for instance, a court protocol, rituals, who has to be where, who can sit, how close can you come to the king, etc. So that works like those were very influential. So the Mana Solasa is from the 12th century. It's a Sanskrit text of the Chalukyas of Kalyana. But large parts of it were copied or were an inspiration. For instance, an 18th century work, the Shiva Tattva Ratnakara, of one of the Nayakas of Ikkeri in Karnataka. So we know that these older works like Mana Solasa were still relevant, were still influential. So that is an example of these older influences, Indic traditions that still flourished.
If I could just also leap in here to add just one more question here, Lennart, because about history as well, right? I think you mentioned that one of the Maratha rulers of Tanjavur, and again, we take that for granted today, but think of what a strange set of historical events led a Maratha to be ruling in Tanjore of all places.
Yes.
And he uses the title Chola in one of his inscriptions. So what can we say about how they saw their past beyond Vijayanagara?
Yeah, so that's, of course, another example. So at one point, the Nayakas of Tanjavur are, well, to keep it simple, they are being replaced by the Bonsles, the Maratha Bonsles from Maharashtra, of course, Maratha speaking. They become the new kings of Tanjavur. But they are, of course, aware of the fact that Tanjavur had been, for centuries, had been the capital of the Kaveri Delta, which was always the heart of the Chola Empire, right? Yeah, let's say half a millennium earlier. So to justify or to indicate that now they ruled this territory, they would also include the term Chola in their titles. But that happened all the time. But to continue to the first question, so you have the Indic tradition, like for instance the Mana Solasa and ideas about court protocol. Then there is the Persianate influence, which you asked about. So you said, okay, we know that Vijayanagara adopted certain practices from the Islamic world, like for instance titles. True, they called themselves Suratrana, Hinduraya, which you could translate. Which you could translate as sultan among Indian kings. They also adopted, for instance, dress, long coats, high conical caps. They adopted that from the Islamic world. And this is where the Dutch sources come in, both for the Islamic Persianate influences and the older Indic traditions. Because, for instance, in reports of Dutch embassies, diplomatic missions to these courts, they record what they were experiencing. So one thing they, for instance, recorded is that the Setupatis of Ramnad or the Nayakas of Madurai were wearing what the Dutch call Moorish clothing. So that refers more or less to Islamic clothing. So these observations by Dutchmen tell us, okay, this Persianate influence, for instance, in royal dress was still continuing. What you also see in these reports of Dutch embassies to these courts is that all the rules about court protocol that are mentioned in a text like the Mana Solasa, these rules still existed. So the Dutch encountered, they experienced these rules. So for instance, were they allowed to sit or did they have to stand? How close could they come to the king? Could they sit on his left side? Could they sit on his right side? There were all these rules, also ideas about what kind of gifts you have to give, eloquence, all these aspects of court protocol. It is very clear from the Dutch sources that this was still existing. What the Dutch have to contribute in this particular case is that even though the rules were mostly the same as the period of the Mana Solasa, these rules could be followed, but they could also be broken. So the Mana Solasa is basically a normative text. Well, at least the part about the audience hall, for instance, it tells you how things should be done. Doesn't mean that it always happened that way. So that's where the Dutch sources contribute and tell us, the rules were also often broken. And people were actually being offended all the time, deliberately, because it's a way of showing your annoyance. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for historians, these courts and the Dutch actually, often annoyed each other because they didn't have the same interests. So there was a lot of conflict going all the time. But that's good because it provides us with sources and descriptions.
So I think, Lennart, this is actually a good time to move to actually talking about the Dutch themselves and what precisely they were doing in South India at the time, especially given your experience with working in the Netherlands National Archives. I'm curious, do you have any interesting stories from the archives? Are there any particular VOC officials whose stories you found particularly fascinating? Are there any documents that you found interesting to kind of handle and kind of work through?
So they, let's say, arrived around the year 1600, stayed for about 2 centuries. They were mostly in the areas of the Vijayana successor states to purchase textiles, which were in great demand in what we now call Indonesia. And in Ikkeri, they were mostly there because they had to buy rice to feed their personnel. So they were there for trade. They didn't really have a desire to conquer lands because that was expensive and it was also not necessary. So you should see the Dutch really as traders, mostly staying at the coast, very often actually in contact with the courts, exchanging people, correspondence, goods, ideas. So there was actually a very intense contact all the time. But it's important to keep in mind that the Dutch were not a colonial power. So they could observe things, they could not really influence things. So I always feel that in their records, it was important for the Dutch to write down how they thought the situation was. For instance, if the Dutch wanted to conclude a new treaty with a court, it was important for them to know, okay, who is the most influential person at the court? It might not be the king. It might be actually someone else. So we need to know what is the political situation, the political setup of this court, because we want to know whom we should get in touch with. So yeah, there were these observers at the coast looking at these courts and trying to find out, okay, what is going on? What is the situation? So that makes these Dutch archives very useful. And I should also say there is a lot. So only for South India, you really talk about hundreds of meters, like in a library, hundreds of meters of documents, handwritten documents that for the most part have not been read by anyone since the Dutch East India Company went bankrupt.
Wow.
So all these records are still there, partly in the Netherlands, but for instance also in the Tamil Nadu archives in Chennai and at other places. And these are very important sources. And you ask me, is there one story that comes to mind? Yeah, and maybe it can also serve as an example of how intense the relations could be between these Dutch and these courts. So the story I think of concerns the court of Ramnad, where the Setupatis were ruling sometime around the mid-18th century. There was a Setupati king, but he was a little boy. So obviously he was not actually ruling the kingdom. Who was actually ruling the kingdom was a general, a Dalavai, as we call it. His name was Vaidavanata Servaikarar. I hope I pronounce it more or less correctly. But he was basically in power, which is very clear from what the Dutch wrote. But there was also the mother of that king. She was a widow. So the previous king had died. His little son had come on the throne, being dominated by this general. And there was the queen mother, the king's mother, who really didn't like the situation. And she was sort of, building another court faction to go against this general. And one thing she did when one of the Dutch ambassadors was actually staying in the capital, Ramnathapuram, during his mission, she tried to contact. So the mother sort of secretly tried to contact this Dutch ambassador and also asked him to visit her, which is quite interesting already. So you have this Dutchman visiting this queen mother. And then she told him that after a conversation, she told him, I consider you my son. Meaning, she explained that the Setupati, king on the throne, is your little brother. And it means you have to protect him. So in a way, she incorporated that Dutchman into the Setupati dynasty, you could say. And that supposedly came with obligations, So what she tried to do is sort of win the Dutch for her. And she was hoping that they could be a counterweight against this general. Well, of course, the Dutch were totally unaware of, that this was, they knew about the power struggle, but they didn't know that they had now sort of been incorporated in the dynasty and, that certain expectations existed. But to me, I like this story because it explains so many things. It tells us about these court politics and how these courts are very dynamic. It comes very clear from this story, but it also shows you how the Dutch, how intense the relations were between the Dutch and these courts. So that's a story I really like.
That's a very interesting story to me, because also it reminds me of this story that's also told about Ramaraya, one of the last Vijayanagara rulers to actually rule from the city of Vijayanagara, where the young Sultan of Bijapur, Ali Adil Shah I, actually came to his court, and Ramaraya's wife declares that this young man is like a son to me. And I wonder if that was also Ramaraya's way of trying to kind of symbolically appropriate Bijapur into the Vijayanagara Empire and kind of declare himself the primus inter pares, as it were, of the sultans, considering that he also called himself a sultan in a way.
I'm aware of this. I'm aware of this story, and I think it is more or less the same case. So this is a way of establishing fictitious family relations, and you do that to sort of bind people, to you. So they they have obligations toward you. They can no longer attack you. They should help you because after all, this person is your son, symbolically perhaps, but still your son. So yeah, I'm not sure if I ever thought of this similarity between these two cases, but I think it's exactly the same. So what you see is that, the Dutch are incorporated in this Indian world. Maybe another example is at one point there is a clash between the Dutch and some troops of the Nayaka of Madurai. It's not a very big clash, but among the Dutch soldiers, there's a particularly strong, powerful soldier who on his own kills lots of soldiers. In the end, the Dutchman is killed himself. The Madurai troops are so impressed by the skills and the bravery of this soldier that they take this Dutch guy from the battlefield. They chop off his head because on the one hand they want to show, we have defeated this mighty warrior, but then they embalm the head and they incense the head, and with music and dancers and whatnot, they return it to the Dutch. So this is also very two-sided. So on the one hand, they want to show the Dutch, hey, we have defeated your strong soldier, but we also really respect him, and we return his head in a respectful way. For me, it's very typical of how the Dutch are incorporated in this Indian environment, and that there are always different sides to every event. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's actually one of my favorite incidents from the book. And to our audience, the book is full of incidents like this. And they just add this color and texture to the Nayaka courts that doesn't very often come across in Indian sources, right? Because Indian sources, if they're epigraphical, tend to be focused on, just these formulaic recitations or rulers' titles. And of course, those contain some historical value. But they don't really tell you a lot about the people who commissioned that inscription, the kind of lives that they were leading day to day, which I think that you do a great job in kind of bringing to life, Lennart. And to your point about how the Dutch are kind of incorporated into the Nayaka worldview, like pretty seamlessly, right? There isn't a lot of friction. Like as soon as the Dutch embassy start to arrive, they have this. Okay, they're like, okay, let's give them a robe of honor. Let's incorporate them into a court in this particular way. They're not necessarily sitting and trying to figure out, will the Dutch be offended? They're like, okay, this is how we do things. Welcome to our world, as it were. And I just find that very interesting because if you were to go back to earlier, right? So we're looking at early modern India at this point. But if you were to go back to medieval India, you see that very similar things happen, of course, when you have Muslims emerging to political power in the Deccan for the first time, where there isn't, of course, there is violence and there is conflict and there is friction, all the other things between these groups, but there's also this almost immediate kind of recognition that, okay, these guys are warriors like us, and let's incorporate them into our warrior culture. So I think if you were to look at the Madurai Vijaya, which is, I think, a 14th century Vijayanagara text, which talks about how they conquered Madurai from the Madurai Sultanate, they're praising the Turks for their marital valor and like how they were fighting the martial valor, and how they're great warriors and so on. And it's very significant, I think, that it does not seem to have been necessarily a religious thing. It seems that commonality is very often found in political interests and economic interests. Cultural accommodations are found through that. And there isn't necessarily a lot of factionalism, at least on the basis that we would expect given our modern politics, right? You have this very interesting passage in your section on courtiers, where you say that except for like one instance where Telugus very clearly form a faction against a Tamil general being appointed, there are barely any cases of like linguistic groups forming rivalries or of religious groups forming rivalries or even castes forming rivalries. The court factions seem to cut across these kind of narrow interests. And I found that to be like a really fascinating point, how it's not really a leap for them to be incorporating the Dutch into all this. And I think it also supports your point about how dynamic these courts could be.
No, I totally agree. And this is, of course, a topic that especially Richard Eaton and Philip Wegener and also others have written about. So it's maybe not so new, although I found the same patterns at the courts that I looked at. But you just mentioned Ramaraya, the last ruler, practical ruler of Vijayanagara before the Battle of Talikota, and he is often seen as some kind of Hindu champion because he was defeated in this battle of 1565, which is often perceived as a battle between, on the one hand, Islamic sultanates and Hindu Vijayanagara, but that is definitely not the whole story. And one thing which is important to realize, for instance, is that Ramaraya actually, in his younger days, was a warrior fighting for Golconda. Yes. So there you go with your religious affiliations. That, exactly as you say, that was often rather unimportant. I wouldn't say it never played a role, but it was not the main thing that determined everything. It's exactly as you say. People would have shared political interests, and that determined political events. So I was actually planning to say this myself, but then you already included it in your question. But true, I've been studying courtiers and court factions at the Nayaka courts, partly from Indian sources, partly from Dutch sources, and you can reconstruct whole careers, and you can reconstruct various groups at the court that were competing with each other, and never ever did I come across a clearly defined religious faction. So let's say Hindus against Muslims. No, you would see factions or alliances of networks of various Hindus, as far as we can use that word in this period. But let's say, a number of Hindus and a number of Muslims together competing with another faction also composed of Muslims and Hindus. That was very normal. And that linguistic event that you mentioned, so Tamils against Telugus, that's the only case I came across where you have like a clear division of faction based on something like language or caste or religion. And so anyway, this was a competition between two groups of Hindus. So Telugu speakers, Tamil speakers, but all Hindus. So also within religions, you could have very strong competition. So there was actually almost nothing in my research that pointed to religion playing a very important part in politics. No. But I'm not sure if I can convince everyone of that.
I find that answer fairly convincing. And of course, the book is much more emphatic in like marshalling the evidence to support this argument. And okay, so with that, I think that we are done with all the audience questions. I, of course, have a ton more, but we've already taken up so much of your time. Lennart, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend time with us and talk about these fascinating people.
So thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Saranaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.